Donc, une conférence Paysages adaptatifs, risque, écologie, éducation, une conférence qui est présentée par la firme d'architecture Lemay, quoi que je pourrais dire interdisciplinaire, parce que de plus en plus, on se diversifie chez Lemay. Et la thématique de cette conférence, je crois, nous touche particulièrement au Québec avec notre proximité à l'eau dans plusieurs régions de la province, dans un contexte où les réalités climatiques évoluent de plus en plus, avec la hausse aussi du niveau des mers. On entend de plus en plus cette expression. Et présentement, au Québec, on en parle très peu, du moins d'un point de vue médiatique, on en parle très peu. Et pourtant, il y a des dangers qui nous guettent avec les changements climatiques. Et récemment, dans la presse, il y avait un petit dossier sur cette île qui voit la mer monter. Le réchauffement fait disparaître les glaces de mer, attise aussi les tempêtes, ce qui accélère l'érosion et précipite les maisons dans l'estuaire du Saint-Laurent. Donc, on est à la recherche de solutions depuis quelques années, je dirais activement. Et ça, cette île, c'est un exemple parmi tant d'autres. Il y a beaucoup de régions qui touchent à l'eau au Québec et qui sont susceptibles, justement, disons qu'il y a des dangers qui les guettent. Et notre prochain invité a remporté avec son équipe le Buckminster Fuller Challenge et la prestigieuse compétition Rebuilt by Design, donc les deux avec le même projet. C'est assez remarquable. Son projet s'appelle Living Breakwaters. C'est un projet de design qui vise à accroître la résilience côtière au nord-est des États-Unis, donc dans la région de New York notamment. Et elle propose des stratégies pour atténuer les inondations, renforcer la biodiversité des habitats côtiers, l'enrichissement des pêcheries. Bref, c'est une approche qui est vraiment, je vous dirais, multicouche, qui pourrait nous inspirer, nous, peut-être, à repenser notre relation, entre autres, avec le fleuve Saint-Laurent et nos paysages côtiers. Juste avant de faire la biographie de notre prochaine conférencière, eh bien, je vais inviter tout de même M. David McComville, qui était conférencier hier, à revenir sur scène pour nous présenter, justement, parce qu'il est à la tête du Buckminster Fuller Institute, et il va nous expliquer pourquoi le projet Living Breakwaters a remporté les grands honneurs cette année avec son institut.
Thank you very much. I was remiss yesterday, actually, and I failed to mention when I showed this slide that our Buckminster Fuller Challenge is open right now. It's been open for the past couple of months, but the window is open until the end of this month. So if you have a project that meets the criteria of something that can potentially help to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense to the disadvantage of anyone, please submit. It's actually a pretty short application process, but Jonathan this morning asked me to just mention something very quickly about why Living Breakwaters won, and I'm in the very fortunate position of chairing an organization where we basically give away money to find the coolest people on the planet, and then I get to meet them, and you're about to meet one of them. And the Buddhists have an idea of these entities called bodhisattvas that are on the planet to ultimately help everyone succeed and to be alleviated of suffering. And I find that these winners of these challenges are very bodhisattva-like characters, and that they're extremely compassionate, and they use design as a way to have compassion on the world. And so I'll just read very quickly the statement of one of our jurors, Bill Browning, from last year about why Living Breakwaters won. And he said, Living Breakwaters is about dissipating and working with natural energy rather than fighting it. It is on the one hand an engineering and infrastructure-related intervention, but it also has a unique biological function as well. The project team understands that if you cannot keep back coastal flooding in the context of climate change, but what you can do is ameliorate the force and impact of 100 and 500-year storm surges to diminish the damage through ecological interventions while simultaneously catalyzing dialogue to nurture future stewards of the built environment. And very importantly, our program manager, Sarah, said that Living Breakwaters deeply knows that doing a physical intervention off the coastline would not be enough to create systemic change. It's a project that's based on connections. The leadership team brings their deep expertise in technology and ecological science into the social dimension onshore in partnership with the community itself. So this is an extraordinary project, and I'm really happy to be here with Gena and looking forward to her comments. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup, David. Alors, Gena Wirth a été formée à la Harvard University Graduate School of Design en architecture de paysage et aussi en urbanisme. Elle agit présentement à titre de chef de projet chez SCAPE Landscape Architecture. C'est une experte, je vous dirais, multidisciplinaire pour créer des paysages riches écologiquement et aussi pertinents culturellement parlant. Donc, on est vraiment très heureux d'accueillir Madame Gena Wirth.
Hello. All right. Thank you so much for joining me so early in the morning. I'm really honored to be here. I want to thank both the sponsors of the conference and the committee of the conference for inviting me here today. I'm truly thrilled to be able to present this work to you. So I apologize. I'm an English speaker. I'm not a French speaker, but I did try to respect the Montreal language laws by including the French title much larger than the English title here. So. Paysages, adaptatifs is the title of my presentation, and I'll be speaking on a number of projects, but really focusing on living breakwaters itself. So my name is Gena. My contact information is here. I'm an associate at SCAPE Landscape Architecture. We're a landscape architecture office in New York City, a city like Montreal, which is surrounded by water. And what we do in our office is we're really trying to expand the field of landscape architecture to extend into the water and really think about shoreline relationships, ocean dynamics, water relationships as part of a kind of full design agenda. And so I'm going to speak very, very briefly on a couple of projects that led up to the genesis of Living Breakwaters itself, and then focus on the proposal of Living Breakwaters. And these couple of projects really work across a wide variety of scales and kind of types of landscape architectural practice, and that's something that we really emphasize and focus on at SCAPE, is that every type of project can be a design project in some way. So SCAPE is a small landscape architecture office located in Lower Manhattan, and much of our work really revolves around this idea of understanding where we are now in this moment, this kind of you are here moment, but understanding how we got there, kind of looking back, thinking about the kind of shifting baselines that shape our perception of place and space. But also really projecting forward, so whether it's kind of melting ice flows, as was recently mentioned, or eroding shorelines, or thinking about temperature change or climate change and sea level rise, our work really tries to anticipate what is next and design across this kind of larger horizon of change. Oyster Texture was a proposal for the Museum of Modern Art. It was a conceptual project developed for the museum, and it was developed in 2009 with the Rising Currents exhibit with 5 other teams of architects and designers. But this was one of the first projects where the office really began to kind of aggressively consider designing in the water and what that might mean in New York City. We were asked by the museum to come up with an idea of how New York City might respond to a storm threat in the future. This was before Hurricane Sandy and before Hurricane Irene, so it was a much more conceptual, speculative kind of idea at that point. And our office formed a kind of partnership with a number of groups and thought about this kind of speculative idea of creating an oyster reef off the shore of the city within the kind of Brooklyn, Bay Ridge Flats area to think about how we could both jointly regenerate certain ecosystems that have been lost from the harbor, but also help make our shorelines more protected. So this was not a strategy to stop storm surge from coming into New York. This is a strategy about mitigating it, reducing the risk, reducing wave action, trying to calm water as it moved into the neighborhood edge. And what this project really kind of drove home, and the main lesson that we've taken away from it and tried to carry forward into all of our work, is that when you think about designing with biological infrastructure, you're really anticipating future growth and change. So the point behind this project and this proposal, this kind of conceptual proposal, was that we could think about trying to put the seeds of an ecosystem in place, of a living biological infrastructure in place that would grow along with the threat of climate change. So we don't know exactly what our future will bring, we don't know exactly how high the waters will be, but if we begin to kind of catalyze an adaptive and responsive infrastructure now, our future will be more secure. The other kind of major element of this project was really thinking about the office forming unconventional partnerships. So with this work, this is the New York Harbor School. It's their scuba team. The New York Harbor School is an educational organization. They're a high school in Governor's Island in New York City, and they base their whole curriculum around the water. So we actually had high school students advising on the development of this project because they have high school students actually raising oysters within their classrooms. They have a hatchery on Governor's Island. Instead of a basketball team, they have a scuba team, so they're truly the experts of living in the New York City waterfront. And so this is a model of the kind of projected proposal that ultimately landed in the exhibit and lived in the museum world, and I think was very formative in a design audience perspective, but wasn't truly kind of shaping planning policy because it was all prior to Hurricane Sandy and before these issues were like truly raised. Another project that we did after the museum projects was a very small scale. So this was not a funded project, so it was kind of a volunteer-driven project. And a marine operator off the coast of Brooklyn in the Bay Ridge Flats, exactly where the oyster texture proposal was, approached us and said, hey, what can we do? We'd like to do something. We don't really have any funds, but we saw your oyster texture proposal. We'd really like to think about, stimulating maritime ecologies along the coastline. So we worked with them and a group of volunteers to kind of test this material that we had been exploring with the exhibition project called Fuzzy Rope, and developed these kind of panels for habitat recruitment that were ultimately placed in that similar project area and kind of tested. So our office works as a very big picture view, but we also try to work at a very small picture view. So this is a series of mussels actually growing along this fuzzy rope infrastructure that was woven by volunteers and kind of tested out in the water. And what's exciting about it is that it's actually trying to stimulate a maritime ecology in an area that's an active maritime industrial environment. So there's lots of barges and piers and active maritime industry happening. So we really think that ecosystems can be regenerated not only once an industry has left in a brownfield condition, but when people are actively occupying a space. And then Sandy hit. Hurricane Sandy hit. It devastated the city. It was a hugely traumatic event for the city, but it also really kind of woke up everyone in terms of the risks that the city truly faced and the risks that the city does face in the future. And so SCAPE was an advisor, along with many other partners, on the New York City Coastal Protection Plan. And I only bring up this document to show that the city is thinking very progressively about how to reshape the coastline, with the city and the state are thinking very progressively about this. The proposal is not to create a singular barrier at the edge of the city that would keep all of the water out. The proposal is to think about how to incrementally adapt the shorelines based upon their kind of specific context and specific risks to coastal flooding. So the strategy is not singular, it's highly variegated and layered, and we were very pleased to be a part of that planning, and as part of that work, we actually had the opportunity to think about kind of science relationships and testing our project with a series of, Arcadis was a hydrodynamic modeler on this project, and we began to test these scenarios in different kinds of shoreline conditions. So the point of this work is that we're really trying to think about these problems and these issues, the kind of issues of coastal flooding, of risk adaptation, of ecological regeneration at these multiple scales, and then where all of that really kind of came together, all of that prior work really came together in this proposal that David introduced so nicely called Living Breakwaters for the South Shore of Staten Island. So I'm going to try to speak on this project for about 20 or 25 minutes or so, and then I'd love to open it up to questions and kind of hear your thoughts. But this is a proposal that was developed for the HUD Rebuild by Design competition, which is, HUD is the Housing and Urban Development Department within the federal government of the United States. And they had sponsored a design competition that involved 10 different design firms and design teams that really looked for different sites around the East Coast that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy and developed strategies for rebuilding these sites that were not purely about building back what once was, but really about building back a more sustainable, a more resilient, and more adaptive, forward-thinking kind of space. So this was our proposal for that work. And it's really critical to mention that we are a landscape architecture firm, and we are really trying to think about designing in this domain of the water, but we do this through a really kind of robust network of teammates and partners. This work is truly a collaborative effort. I think that's what really resonated with the Buckminster Fuller Award Committee, is that we are not doing this alone, we're really doing this in partnership, and we have partners that you might think are conventional partners on this project, so that includes Parsons Brinckerhoff, a major global engineering firm, Stevens Institute of Technology, who did a lot of hydrodynamic modeling with our project, ocean and coastal consultants, which are maritime engineers, but then also some maybe kind of atypical partners. So CR Consulting is a group based out of Israel, who are marine biologists and scuba divers, and they're developing alternative technologies and materials for the waterfront environment. The New York Harbor School, a series of high school students and maritime educators were on our team. So we're really trying to think about broadening the audience and the group of people involved in planning infrastructure. LoTech is an architecture office in New York City, and MTWTF is a graphic design and communications office. And then Paul Greenberg is a writer who writes really excellent books on the kind of risk that the American fisheries face. So I think the kind of team was very robust and quite interesting and really helped shape the project. And so Living Breakwaters is really about this kind of big picture idea of resiliency, not defining resiliency purely as physical risk reduction or physical resiliency, but really about expanding that definition and thinking about what does it mean to be kind of culturally or socially resilient? How do we think about developing a kind of shoreline community that understands the risk of living on the water? And also about ecological resiliency. How do we think about not only preserving the ecosystems that do exist in New York City, but expanding and diversifying them? And so this work really started with this kind of like regional analysis and understanding, and we were really impacted by this kind of drawing that we did of how does New York City shape up to other countries facing these similar questions and other cities facing these other questions. And what we found was that New York City, because we face hurricanes here in New York, has a much higher degree of potential risk. So that horizon which you're planning for is much more uncertain in the future. In the Netherlands, there's a 3.5-foot approximate difference between the 500-year flood and the 10,000-year flood. So when you're setting wall elevations, it's a little bit easier to think about what that should be. In New York, it's a much higher range. It's almost 9 feet. So there's a huge variability and kind of aesthetic and cultural impact that shoreline infrastructure might take. We also really realized that bay landscapes are truly at risk within the Sandy-affected area. So there were many human communities that were very dramatically impacted by Sandy, but there were also very many ecological communities impacted by Sandy, and that as sea levels rise and as storms become more intense, the small fringes of wetlands and coastal ecosystems and estuaries that do exist are getting thinner and thinner, smaller and smaller. And so we began to look really in detail at these ecosystems and try to characterize them as the shallows, these shallow water ecosystems, and think about, rather than designing a kind of singular moment of flood control infrastructure that might be a wall along the shore or a seawall along the shore, but we're really trying to think about, let's think about this layered approach. Let's think about designing with these shore-like ecosystems in a long series of layers, extending from upland to offshore and combining them. And what that gives you really is a kind of much stronger relationship with the water and more dynamic and interactive ways of using the waterfront. And that could really help spur a culture of resiliency developed around the shoreline. And so that's the kind of overall regional research that drove this project, and I'm going to focus on each of the kind of 3 categories behind the work. So from a physical perspective, from a physical risk reduction, Staten Island is, yesterday, Fresh Kills very nicely set up the context of Staten Island. Now we're looking on the bay side as opposed to the Arthur Kill side. But Staten Island is here, and it's right at the mouth of the New York Bight. So this is the geomorphology of the harbor, actually funneling water and wave action and storm surge right into Staten Island. So the island itself is highly vulnerable, and risk is expressed in different ways around the island. Our project focused on the South Shore, which is here, this space here. And what's really interesting about the South Shore is not only are there concerns of flooding, there's severe concerns of erosion, both historic erosion in the past and future erosion projected. So many, many acres of land have been lost in the last 100 years, and many, many acres are projected to be lost. And in New York City, every square foot of land is highly valuable. So this is a kind of a physical phenomena that's actually very visible in the world. So beach erosion is quite clear and visible. You can begin to see pipelines from historic streets that have been completely eroded appearing within the beach systems. There's kind of cliffside erosion, so even if you think about a home that's elevated out of the floodplain, is still at risk because the cliff sides on which its foundation is based are washing away. There's infrastructure failure along the shore, and that the seawalls have a kind of finite lifespan, and they need upgrade, need to be kind of rethought. And then there's these kind of fragile systems in that the systems that have been designed as emergency responses are kind of fragile in nature and designed in conditions that don't necessarily allow for longevity. And then any kind of shoreline infrastructure truly has access kind of questions and issues. So this is an emergency dune system that's been put in on the shoreline. Obviously, there's some conflicts here in terms of how this space once was used and can be used in the future. But there's also this kind of visual barrier in terms of this is a community that's developed around living around the shoreline and living around the water in New York, and that kind of experience is now lost. And then there's places where that kind of physical infrastructure is simply not possible. So we have a lot of water-based economies, and that there's ports and marinas and smaller scale kind of fishing operations and shell fishing operations happening within these areas. So access to the water is quite critical and should be celebrated. And so our project is called Living Breakwaters, and the proposal is a series of living breakwaters. And breakwaters are a relatively traditional coastal protection technique. So the breakwater infrastructure itself is not necessarily innovative, but we think it's innovative in the application here, and that we are proposing this as the technique for kind of coastal risk reduction in this area. And what breakwaters do is that they reduce wave action. They do not stop flooding. So they can be exposed, they can be subtidal, they can exist within many heights of the kind of water elevation, but they do not stop water from coming through. They simply slow it, calm it, and reduce the most highest velocity waves. And so they also help create sedimentation and build beaches depending upon their proximity to the shoreline. So the further out they're spaced, the more, or the kind of less impact on shoreline change they have. But there's a lot of very narrow beaches in Staten Island, especially in Tottenville, that could use some additional sedimentation. So it's about not only designing the breakwater infrastructure, but designing its relationship with the shore. And so a lot of our work really focused on trying to develop a community constituency around this project and this proposal. And we had to be really clear when dealing with everyone, from regulators to policymakers to community members, what the breakwaters can do and what they cannot do. So they do not keep out floodwater. We feel that we live on the shoreline. This is the kind of risk that you take, and you should be educated about it, and that you should have building structures that adapt to that. But that what we can do is we can reduce erosion, we can lessen the wave impacts, which are the most life-threatening and dangerous elements of a storm surge. The breakwaters themselves can provide habitat and encourage recreational fisheries, and they can also build beaches and kind of enhance the recreational nature of the space. So breakwaters were proposed for a number of kind of stretches and series along the shore. I'm just gonna check my time here, yeah. And what we did is we really focused on the southernmost point, this concept of this area of Tottenville, which is an existing kind of park ecosystem, narrow beach condition. Many of those photos that I shown were taken here. But the concept here was to build a kind of necklace of protective living breakwaters that helped reduce risk within this neighborhood, helped build the shore, and revive the recreational economy of Tottenville. And so this is the kind of cross-section of the project, a series of breakwaters offshore, a kind of zone of sedimented and kind of calmer water behind, an expanded beach behind, and then multiple educational and community connections back to the neighborhood, which I'll speak on in a little bit. In other sites, we see this strategy as highly adaptable. It could be highly adaptable to kind of sites here in this city that have sensitive kind of shoreline ecosystems. But that it could actually be used to help protect sensitive shoreline ecosystems and enable new edges in maritime economies. So we see it as something that's highly replicable and modular. Within our work, it's really important to think about kind of analyzing it from a social and ecological perspective, but also analyzing from a scientific perspective. So we worked with the Stevens Institute to model the hydrodynamic conditions that existed during Hurricane Sandy, and then think about how they would be changed with a series of breakwaters. So in many instances, we're getting almost 5 feet of wave reduction, which can mean the difference between your house getting wet and your house getting swept off its foundation. And so this work really aligns with a lot of other ongoing initiatives within New York. I already mentioned the Coastal Protection Plan. This is the state-led Governor's Office of Storm Recovery New York Rising Plan. So it's really important to think about developing projects that do not work against other initiatives that are happening, especially with the U.S. Army Corps study. There's a proposal for what should happen with the Army Corps in Phase 1, which is the east shore of Staten Island, but in the south shore of Staten Island, it's a much bigger question, what should be done, so our proposal kind of fits within that framework. And then from an ecological perspective, this is really where the word living begins to play a much larger role. So this is where we move beyond kind of traditional engineering and say that we think about ecology as important from a biodiversity standpoint, but it's also important from an economy, infrastructure, and educational standpoint. So within Staten Island, it's very important to think about kind of protecting essential fish habitat and existing species, because Raritan Bay is a highly dynamic ecosystem. It is a coastal ecosystem. It has certain kind of fish species, so we're really trying to time the construction of this project around the life cycles of these species, especially to avoid flounder mating season, which is very important in New York. There's also really active shellfish economies that happen in this area, and we don't want to design an infrastructure that impedes that. So marking those areas and understanding them was a really critical part of this work, and we actually did that through a hands-on exercise with the clammers of Staten Island. We met with the Department of Environmental Conservation, and they actually said, we don't have the maps of where these hard clam populations are, and they directed us to meet with them ourselves. And so that was a really kind of formative new audience to bring into the infrastructure planning conversation. And then finally, we're not thinking about designing purely to protect existing ecosystems. We're really trying to think larger and more projectively about what will the ecosystems of the future be within this area. And we know that Raritan Bay is a prime habitat for juvenile fish. So fish, large kind of ocean-going adults actually swim up the Hudson. They spawn in the Hudson. There's a nursery within the Hudson River. That's where the very baby fish live. And then the kind of juvenile fish, the teenage fish, hang out for a year in Raritan Bay. So we thought, how can we really design and provide structure for these juvenile fish? And what juvenile fish need are really little tiny niches that are sized to their body so they can hide. And this actually reflects the kind of past historic ecosystems which used to exist here, these oyster reef systems, which have all these little tiny niches and are keystone species that really allow juvenile fish and other organisms to kind of grow and flourish within them. Those have all been lost from the harbor. We have lots of flat walls. We have lots of denuded spaces. And so this breakwater project could really begin to add these little niches back into the harbor ecosystem. So our kind of ecological strategy really modifies what's a typical breakwater by modifying the form to avoid critical habitat, working our way around it, creating localized microscale complexity that has these kind of smaller pore spaces, and then orienting that complexity towards the waveward side of where the waves are coming from, so those little pore spaces don't get filled up with sediment over time. And what we're calling these little micro pockets of complexity are reef streets. So these become little zones where juvenile fish can actually feed in the street and then shelter in the structure itself. So this is a kind of an innovation that we're advancing in tandem with CR Consulting, who's developing a maritime concrete material that's actually developed for its enhanced ability to recruit maritime organisms. And there's this whole series of kind of microtextures and macrotextures that they're designing into this that are actually based upon the size of the fish that would be using this space. So this is an image of how we imagine this infrastructure might actually begin to look. And there's a whole variety and series of layered ecosystems working within here, and it's also part of a layered strategy that extends from upland to offshore. You can see kind of wave action coming in from the left here, hitting the breakwater, being dissipated and creating a kind of calmer water beach enhanced zone behind. And this habitat is really designed to work across a number of levels, from the subtidal through to the intertidal through to the exposed. Harbor seals are coming back to New York Harbor. It's very, very exciting, and they actually need these kind of independent islands to haul out on. They jump up on them and They kind of bask themselves in the sun. So it really can begin to be a really robust ecosystem from underwater to above ground. And then oysters. I started this project talking about oysters. They're actually highly controversial in New York City, but we really love oysters for a number of reasons within the office, partially because they are a true ecosystem engineer. They build reef systems, they help attenuate waves, they help encourage sedimentation and marsh building, but also because they're really tied to the culture and history of Staten Island itself. So these are historic oyster beds and then aquaculture beds extended off the shore of Staten Island. So this series of slides that I'll go through really quickly. Oysters used to kind of exist in certain historic locations. They were very abundant. The beds were extended as part of a larger oyster farming strategy and economy of New York City. There was an oyster industry decline in that they were over-harvested. Dredging and sediment and contamination of the water led to the kind of almost complete erasure of oysters within New York Harbor. But now there's many groups working to bring oysters back. So the New York Harbor School is one of those. But there's many other groups that have identified Raritan Bay as a prime site for oyster restoration. And so we're really excited about oysters because they have the ability to grow over time, to grow in response to climate change. They're a historically and culturally relevant ecosystem. They're a keystone species. So they create massive amounts of biodiversity that's really lacking in the harbor right now. They're filter feeders. They reduce nutrient contamination within waters. They help clean water. But also they're a really interesting kind of educational teaching tool. They're a way of teaching about the harbor in a much broader way. And there's challenges as well, though. So we're trying not to kind of purely exist in a totally optimistic world. We're trying to really tackle the realities of this work as well as the opportunities. So oysters are an attractive nuisance and threat to human health and safety, and that water quality is not up to par in New York. You can't harvest an oyster and then eat it. You'll get sick. I do not recommend eating oysters from New York City. But that's a regulatory issue. So the USDA and many other regulator partners are very concerned about oyster restoration in that it brings up, if someone ate those oysters, it's potentially harmful. And it could compromise the active shellfish economies of New Jersey and Long Island. And there's also kind of long-term viability questions, and there's habitat displacements questions of if you have an area that has hard clams now, is it worthwhile trying to restore oysters in that zone? So there's a lot of complex ecological questions brought up, and we're trying to address that in a number of ways. This is the series of breakwater system with our 5 oyster kind of restoration strategies applied onto here, and we're really looking for this to be a kind of large-scale pilot and way of using oysters. But we also love oysters because people love oysters. They're kind of like a charismatic microfauna of New York. So there was a lot of community support about this project and a lot of community support around the oyster restoration efforts. And that really ties into this idea of what does it mean to be a neighborhood that embraces the shoreline as part of your identity, and what does it mean to kind of help stimulate a culture of resiliency. And so this effort was really led by our partners at the Billion Oyster Project at the New York Harbor School. As I mentioned, the Harbor School is a whole school that devotes their curriculum to the waterfront, but they're creating curriculum packages for other New York City schools to engage the waterfront because they're trying to spread their message and their work. And so this is a series of schools within Staten Island located within walking distance of the water. And that we really think that these schools can be brought in and participate in the conversation about infrastructure along the water's edge. And so we had the Harbor School do a series of teacher training workshops to help the teachers understand how to bring their students down to the water and educate on kind of water-based issues around the oyster. And so students, we also developed as a design product of this competition, an oyster gardening manual that would allow teachers and students to kind of use these curriculum tools at the water's edge and do oyster gardening, where you have a cage of oysters, you have a classroom of students, and they're responsible for monitoring, measuring, and kind of cataloging those oysters over time. And so this really became a kind of a wake-up moment of understanding that we can't simply, as it was stated earlier, we can't simply think about designing infrastructure along the edge. We have to develop the constituency around that infrastructure and enable the use of that infrastructure as part of the project. And so we came up with this idea of the water hubs, which are really kind of critical to the overall work in general. They become the shoreline link between schools, community members, and the waterfront itself. And these are structures that kind of locate along the shoreline at different components and moments and really become ways of opening up the water to a much broader community. And so the water hub in Tottenville was kind of designed by low-tech architects in collaboration with many community partners. So the community partners identified a number of activities that could happen here and wanted to happen here in terms of kayak storage and cafe space and wet lab space. But in New York, we really need more infrastructure along the shoreline. The waterfront's not necessarily a very inhabitable place all the time, especially in the winter. So you need ways of accessing the shore, programming it, providing a bathroom, providing very simple methods of access. And so this community-led design charrette is beginning to kind of permeate and happen as the project evolves. We've created a lot of other kind of engagement and kind of outreach tools to help talk about these different ecologies and how they work within these communities. And much of our work within this project has really been about developing a constituency for the shoreline and developing a community of people that are kind of very active and engaged in this project, but also active and engaged in kind of stewarding the shoreline in the future. And so the Tottenville project was proposed as a pilot for this Rebel by Design competition, and our team was very lucky in that the project was selected as a winner of the competition, also as the winner of the Buckminster Fuller Institute Prize, which is a huge honor. But it was funded by HUD for $60 million of implementation funding. The funding is given to New York State Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, who is now the owner and manager of the project, and they're carrying it forward. We're advising on that being carried forward. So this phase 1 pilot is kind of our pathway for executing that. But it's truly happening. So it's a very exciting moment within the office. It's a very exciting moment for New York City. It's a long-term project. It's going to take a number of years to advance. But what we really love about this project is it's not only a project about these kind of extreme moments within the fabric of the city, it's really about trying to create space that resonate on the everyday and are productive places year-round, every day. So I'm just going to kind of close on this image, which is an image of the kind of fully designed system that extends from the shoreline to the uplands and really thinks about this kind of larger host of community partners. I wanted to close with this quote of the Buckminster Fuller of "Don't fight forces, use them." That's what our project really aims to do and hopes to do in the future. So I'd love to open it up for questions. Thank you.